everyone. Welcome to Zonan Canada. I'm your host, Jesse Betteridge. So this is a podcast that focuses on the connections between anime and Canadian media. But over the last few months, I've been thinking a lot about things like soft power and nation-building projects for some reason. Personally, this always makes my mind go back to our animation industry. Even though that's maybe not where everyone's mind immediately goes, but it is where mine goes. And I think about what we're doing in this industry now, what we've done, and what we could be doing in the future. Could cartoons be a nation-building project? I don't know. That's an ambitious question. I want to pick some people's brains about this, about our own animation industry, how it overlaps with some of the other things we talk about on this podcast. And I've had a few Canadian animation figures on this show. Of course, we've had Hervé Bedard, executive producer of Cybersix. We've had Gene Fowler from Lougarou Studios in a very memorable episode recently, and I'm really excited about who I brought on today. So he was the director of the first two seasons of the Hilda series, animated by Mercury Filmworks, and for the last few years, he's been working on the animated horror web series Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark, which I personally think is one of the coolest things going on in Canadian animation today. It is Andy Coyle. Andy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Jesse. It's cool to be here.
Let's just talk about what you're working on now. I think that people should be checking out Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark if they aren't already. So it's a web series. I know it was being pitched to be picked up by a streamer or broadcaster. Previously, I'm not sure what the status of that is, but as of the time of this recording, there are 3 episodes that you can watch on YouTube and a few shorts as well. The episodes are The Pine Creepers, The Worm, and The Devil's Rock. Can you just tell us a bit about this project, like kind of where it started and where it's at right now?
Yeah, definitely. It's an animated horror anthology series. So it's something that I was super interested in delving into just because I love horror and I believe that animation can really do all kinds of different stories justice. I think like as an art form, it's perhaps a bit pigeonholed, at least in the West,
Mm-hmm.
with a majority of sort of like what the Western animation industry produces is kind of focused, at least up until recently, on a lot of kids material and then a very specific like sort of lane of adult material that kind of like the prime time animated stuff inspired by the Simpsons and the Family Guys kind of thing, right? And
Yeah,
so
a lot of the a lot of that's digital puppetry these
yeah,
days too. Yeah.
and I've felt like for a long time that animation could tell any kind of story. You could
Mhm.
tell a really great action story or even a romance. You could do any kind of stuff in animation, including horror. And I feel like it was something that I hadn't seen a whole bunch, at least in a presentation that was like straight horror, that wasn't sort of like couched in sort of like a thick layer of irony or comedy, sort of like that sort of the Scooby-Doo kind of idea
Yeah.
of being like, oh, it's spooky in quotation marks, but
Or
it's kind
A
of
Halloween special on
yeah,
regular show or The Simpsons or something,
yeah.
which
I mean, it's
sneaks in a little bit of horror, actual horror sometimes, but it's pretty.
yeah, but
Yeah.
that's not the main sort of like point
Hmm.
of appeal of it, right? And I've always felt like that would be some fun to do. And I had been pitching properties that I felt like would be really awesome stuff that I would love to see. But there was a lot of resistance and I wasn't getting anywhere trying to get something like that off the ground. So I thought, well, um, I'll just make something like that myself and sort of see um, if there's an audience for anything like that. And it sort of began by just me in my basement messing around, making this first episode of Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark, which was the Pine
Yeah.
Creepers.
And the Pine Creepers, that was just you at a small, very small staff. It was totally independent at that
It
point,
was
right?
essentially just me.
Yeah.
At some point, I did have some help. Like one of like the main pillars of Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark is my buddy Ryan
Hmm.
Carlson, who me and him worked together when we were making Hilda. And while I was making the Pine Creepers, I was also in production on Hilda. It was, I think, around the time I was doing the second season of Hilda. I probably was sort of deep in production of the second season and in production on or pre-production on the movie, the Hilda movie that I did. And then I had sort of started this side thing as a escape to do something that I felt like was like no pressure and
Hmm.
no like there was no demands from anybody on me. It was just me having fun making something that I really liked. And I had showed some of it to Ryan, and he was like, "Oh man, that is like super cool. Do you want me to do some music for it?" And obviously, I was like, yeah, like definitely, dude, that would be so cool." And I had sort of edited the entire thing to a click track because most of the time I do like when I'm making stuff, if I'm sort of doing an animatic, I use a lot of temp music to structure things, just to give it like sort of like the form and the skeleton that it needs, so I can pace things properly and make sure I emphasize specific like storytelling beats. But in this case, I was so just on my own that I thought, I'll just do a click track. That'd be fun. Like it's just like a like a drum track,
Hmm.
click track, and I'll pace it all to that. And I had sort of ballparked it all in, and it felt like, okay, yeah, this is pretty spacious. If anything, I had kind of at the time felt like, oh, it's kind of slow. I might need to like trim this up or whatever. And then I gave that to Ryan, and he did some stuff over. He did some initial tracking, sent it back to me, and I was like, "Oh no, oh God, what have I done? I need to like re-edit this entire thing because it now feels like way too fast, and I am stepping all over all of these beats, and there's not enough room for everything to sort of breathe." So I did end up bringing my other buddy Johnny McKinnon in to help me take Ryan's music and sort of like just chop it up a little bit, loop it a couple times, and we'll sort of like repace and rejigger the way I was editing it. And then the only other person who came in was my buddy Shane, who has worked with me on almost all the Don't Walk Home Alone After Darks. He did not have anything to do really with the Worm, but that was just a timing thing where he
Hmm.
was super busy, and the Worm was a very like crazy sort of scattered production. But he had done a couple shots of some stuff at the very end just to add some animation to some pieces, and like even one shot like at the very end of the Pine Creepers where the kids are coming out of the tent. And originally I had just sort of like a still image in there. Um, and then I thought, oh, it would be really cool to like actually animate them coming
Hmm.
up and walking towards the Buick in like this pushed sort of bird's eye perspective. And Shane, I just drew sort of like the characters in the thing, and then Shane made it all move. And it was super cool. But other than that, it was me just it was a short story I had written,
Yeah, and it came to
recorded
about
it.
12 episodes, or sorry, 12 minutes. I think is the first
Yeah, it's
episode.
probably about that. I think
Yeah.
the short story I had written was a bit longer, and I had ended up sort of chopping it down a bit just to
Hmm.
sort of fit it into this format, which was kind of like a necessity, trying to produce something um, in your spare time alone. It was like, okay, how do I get this whole story out? And so I relied a lot on this first person narration, where I just recorded myself saying the
Hmm.
story, reading out the prose sort of from the perspective of this character, that I think sort of allowed me to do a lot of the heavy lifting and then pick moments where I can lean in and say, like, okay, I'm gonna really like make this shot a little more articulated and do some more full range of animation here. And it all kind of worked. And at the time I wasn't really intentionally thinking of doing anything with it. It was just for fun. It was, um, I thought I'll just do this. I'll put it out on YouTube, and
And then
I
it
didn't
blew
have,
up.
yeah, I didn't have any
Yeah.
expectation that like it was
Yeah.
gonna be a big deal at all. But I thought, in my mind, it was, man, if I could get 10,000 views on this video, that would be pretty insane. Like that would be a huge amount for an audience from nothing to just
Hmm.
dump a video on YouTube and be like, hey, what do you guys think? And it ended up doing a lot more than that. And
Yes.
I at the time I remember thinking like, oh, like if this really justifies a lot of the stuff I was saying, that I know there is an audience for this kind of material. It's just that I think they're maybe a little underserved by the stuff they have to choose from, at least here in North America.
Yeah, so it blew up, and then you did a couple the other two over the course of a few years. The other two episodes. Maybe we'll get to those a bit later, but I know that at some point, from what I was reading, you and Mercury Filmworks were trying to pitch the show a couple of years ago. But has it not been? Was there no interest? Is there just not? Are there challenges with trying to get something like this, or trying to get a streaming platform or broadcaster on board with a project like this?
There are some obviously challenges in terms of getting original properties greenlit. Obviously, this is a difficult landscape right now in particular, but there has been sort of a couple different iterations of what I would love to do with it as a big sort of broadcast or streaming series. I think currently I am developing a specific iteration of it, and I made this video that I'm going to be releasing fairly soon from the time that we're having this recording. And it's kind of like a proof of concept for what I would love to do with the series adaptation of Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark.
Hmm.
It's uh, fully diegetic, sort of in the language of what I want the TV show to feel like. I think it's super cool. I hope that the YouTube audience really loves it. Regardless of what happens with sort of the potential stuff that's happening with the series adaptation, I think that there's like a world where what I would love to do is just continue the YouTube version of Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark and have a series version of Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark, and it's all like the same cinematic world
Right.
that it's playing in. And I feel like that's such an interesting idea for a property, to sort of have this, not just sort of the conventional sort of cinematic universe of a bunch of things in the same sort of format being connected, but like different formats and different ideas on different platforms. I think it's a really fascinating idea to me, and I would love to see um how to make something like that work. But right now, that is still very much on the table. I am currently, I don't know how much I can say about
Hmm.
specifically that the TV show development of it, because there are people involved in that, but I would really love for it to happen. Which I'm hopeful. I think the timing's right. I think like this feels really good. There's a lot of potential. Things are starting to turn around in terms of the streaming world. And I think this past 5 years has been fairly chaotic for the animation industry and the for buyers who sort of like put content out. So I think it's looking positive, and I would love to see if that could be the next step for Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark.
And you mentioned Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark has reaches kind of an untapped audience, at least for as far as Western animation is um, concerned. So I'm assuming you mean something that's kind of that in between kids and adults, maybe sort of teens or young adult audience that wants something that's not quite kids action and adventure and not quite adult comedy. But it's something that in that space where obviously anime occupies a large part of that space, and part of why it's become so popular is because there's not really a Western equivalent to that. Which
Yeah.
something that goes back to last century, and also sort of continues today, even whether you're looking at Canadian streamers or American streamers. Netflix very much has this idea that, oh, we make this kind of stuff for kids. And of course, you don't have to comment on any of the policies of how these streamers work, because I know you're trying to work with them. But they very much say this is what we can do, like this full animation kind of adventure stuff for kids. For adults, you have, on one hand, there is the digital puppetry kind of comedy animation that's more like a sitcom, and then there's the quote unquote action anime stuff like Castlevania. But again, that's all for adults. There's still kind of this space in between that is not really being tapped, and it feels like Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark kind of fills that space. And I don't know if that has been a challenge, but I'm assuming that is sort of the audience that you had in mind with that. That's kind of the impression I'm getting.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, one of the cool things is I have a lot of information from my YouTube channel about who actually
Mm-hmm.
digs Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark. And it's a pretty solid chunk of like 18 to 35, 2/3 male, 1/3 female kind of audience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so obviously I think there's probably a percentage of YouTube accounts that claim to be over 18 that are perhaps not
That's
over
always
18.
that's the funny thing about YouTube stats, is that,
So,
yeah.
I think in reality, it skews sort of slightly more adult maybe than the YA sort of
Mm-hmm.
space, but it's sort of in that zone, definitely.
I was going to ask also about sort of what some of your influences are for both for horror and animated horror, if you have
Yeah.
much. I mean, I like a lot of the older um, kind of shoujo horror from Japan. Yeah, I'm sure you know, like Kazuo Umezu. There was like an OVA, like just a
Mhm.
short video they did, The Curse of Kazuo Umezu, which is great because it uses such limited animation, and which is funny because you see a lot of lavish projects that sometimes kind of fail to capture horror, but then you have this like very limited animation thing from the 90s, and it's like, oh, this captures this vibe perfectly. My good friend Dave Merrill introduced me to this absolutely bizarre shoujo horror thing called Yumeji Tanima's Scream Theater. I mean, I guess I
I've
could
heard of
show
it.
you. It is the weirdest thing. It's like a motion comic, but it's color. It has these like super abrasive colors that make it look like it was animated on an Amiga. And it's just the creepiest damn thing I've ever seen. And one thing that I've actually noticed with Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark is that uh, obviously there's a lot of limited animation sequences, which a big part of it is because you're producing this independently for the most part, or with a small staff. But these are things that I find Western animation usually sees as a weakness when you have long panning shots or zooms, or you focus on something for a long time to build. But it's a great way of building suspense and tension and atmosphere. And certainly by the third episode of Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark, the Devil's Rock, it definitely feels that you have these great action set pieces, but also you're taking the time to sort of build tension with more limited animation, and it just has such a good grasp of how to have that balance. And I think that, again, this is something that I find Western animation lacks a lot. It's just afraid to slow things down a bit sometimes, or just focus on a still shot, or maybe just the back of someone's head. It's seen as, oh, that you're being cheap, you're cutting, you're just trying to cut costs. It's like, no, that you can get a lot of you can
Yeah.
get a dramatic cinematic effect out of this.
Yeah, definitely. And that was like a specific choice
Mm-hmm.
that I made, obviously because of the pragmatic realities of trying to make something and being like, some of these stories are quite large. And so to be able to execute anything at that scale, you kind of have to figure out how to make that in a way that's not going to take 25 years to realize the whole piece. Because I find, and I get, that may not be for everybody. To me, I feel like it's really interesting, and that contrast in pacing is very deliberate, and a huge part of Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark, and why I think it kind of works, is that I am able to lean in and take the time to establish the mood and the atmosphere, and linger on certain things, be a little contemplative.
Hmm.
I think, like, especially the don't like the Devil's Rock. um it, it starts on a prolonged, like, 30 seconds of, like, quiet, that you come in from the black on the sound of a car door chime ringing, and then you just hold on this car left open on the side of a desolate country road. You listen to the wind rustling through the fields. You take your time just getting there, and conventional wisdom, I guess, would say, like, oh, no, no, that's like a terrible choice for a YouTube video. You're
Hmm.
going to lose your audience. They're going to immediately click off if you don't smack them in the face in the first 5 seconds. Um, but it works, I guess, for at least for that. I don't know. I don't know exactly why. It's the right creative choice, I guess, and that, I think, is people aren't quite so predictable as you might think.
I mentioned asking about your influences, then I proceeded to go on about stuff I like, which was very rude. What are sort of your influences as far as horror, or do you have any for animated horror specifically that you draw from?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, animated horror is a tough one because there's not a ton of material to choose from outside of anime. I think there is. um I was, obviously, as a kid, the big sort of stuff that everybody kind of was hit with, which was, Ghost in the Shell, Akira,
Hmm.
Ninja Scroll, stuff like that. The Studio Ghibli movies of, like, the Princess Mononoke and all kinds of stuff like that was very formative, and they all have sort of elements of intensity built in. There's a lot of, like, mostly action stuff, I guess. But then I also was really captivated by those sort of 80s OVAs, like those ones that you would find in video stores that you could rent,
Hmm.
that you're like, what is this? Like Cyber City, Oedo,
I love
and
that
and
one so
like
much.
Angel Cop, like stuff where you're
Yeah,
like, what is this, as a kid? And you could rent it and no one knew you were renting something that
yeah.
maybe
The
you
stuff
shouldn't
with
have.
just has moments that just they're just scarred into your brain forever.
Yeah.
These moments like, how did a person even conceive of creating a visual like this?
Yeah.
And it
And
just
I'm not
blows
I'm
my
not
mind.
an
Yeah.
anime
Hmm.
expert by any means. I just, that was the stuff I had access to, because I lived, in the middle of nowhere in northern New Brunswick. And so if it wasn't on TV on the, two channels that I could get with an antenna, uh the only way for me to really find stuff was to make the, half hour or 45-minute pilgrimage to the nearest movie theater, or go to the video store and rent a VHS, and see what they had, just random stuff that, you would discover on a weekend. So there was all that kind of stuff. I think when I was really young, obviously I've always loved animation.
Hmm.
Like, the first movie I ever saw in the movie theater was The Land Before Time. That Bluth stuff was big back, in the 80s. It was a big thing. That was a weird time for animation in particular, where Disney had kind of slumped, and you had some really interesting stuff sort of competing. Um, but then I guess, like, in terms of anime, maybe like Astro Boy was a big, thing, because you could find it on places. Oh, and there was I don't know if you remember this, or if you know anything about it. I don't really know much about it, but there was, like, this Jungle Book anime
Oh yeah, I remember that one. Yeah.
that used to come on Canadian TV.
Yeah,
Um,
they ran it quite a bit. I remember that one.
so I don't know anything
Um,
about this or why it was on Canadian TV, but I was obsessed with this show as a kid. I loved it. Um, and it had, like, real interesting sort of like degrees of serialization going on. There was great sophisticated storytelling. I mean, obviously it's a kid show, so it's not like, you know, the most crazy complex thing, but it was something really interesting that you could watch this sort of more complex form of serialized storytelling in an animated series at that time. It would probably, I guess it would have been like late 80s, early 90s around when that was on TV. But that was a really cool one. Oh, and heavy metal too.
Oh,
Yeah, I should
heavy
say
metal.
that.
Yeah,
Heavy metal was like, as a Canadian animation connection, is
I was
like,
gonna ask you like just Canadian animation influences specifically, and you know, heavy metal that counts in my books.
yeah, definitely. I think like it was that had all kinds of elements of horror. You like that whole the green orb sequences.
Hmm.
Um that is like horrific stuff. The way that movie opens and closes, and it's like this is some pretty wild stuff. Tarna was such a cool idea. The the girl on the pterodactyl or whatever it is, like this is like such cool stuff. I don't know about horror movies in particular. I guess like I love obviously like there's so much horror stuff that I love that it's hard to narrow it
There's
down.
more than ever now. It seems like people complain about there being like they're like, oh, everything's superhero movies, and now they're saying all these, you know, there's so many independent alternatives. Like, but it's all horror. It's all great, but there's so much horror you can't even
Yeah.
watch it all. You can't pick.
There's a ton and there's cool stuff. There's cool stuff that's getting made, you
I'm
know.
not
Like
knocking modern horror at all. It's great, but it's like there's so much of it. It's hardly a niche anymore.
yeah.
How can you not be influenced by it?
Yeah. Oh, I one a recent movie I saw was Bring Her Back. That's a
Hmm.
great movie. I really love that stuff. Black Christmas. Have you ever watched the original Black
I have,
Christmas?
yes, yes.
The Bob Clark. It's just I love that movie so much. You know, it's foundational sort of like Canadian cinema, and I think it clearly inspired um John Carpenter for
Hmm.
Halloween.
Yes.
I think obviously like you look at what Black Christmas is and you say like a natural extrapolation of that would be okay, just like take those ideas and kind of change the holiday. And you end up with Halloween. And I love John Carpenter movies too. I love like all those early John Carpenter movies. They're so cool. Like the Thing is like a masterpiece. Um and like his whole Apocalypse trilogy stuff, the Prince of Darkness. Um
I found it interesting. He goes from like high budget stuff to like no budget stuff,
yeah,
like
yeah.
seamlessly through that trilogy, especially. It's which is neat, and yeah.
Yeah, I think like I would say he's a huge influence on me, I think. Because there's stuff like it's hard to parse out like what is an influence and what is just stuff that you like. And
Hmm.
I obviously I think that cinema is a language that you speak essentially. It's about like communicating ideas from your own imagination, your head, making it sort of unfold in this way that someone is going to experience it and be able to have those ideas go from your head into their head. And it's a form of communication really, and it's sort of a language that you speak. And I think that uh, I learned how to speak it by just watching stuff as a kid. So all the stuff that I was exposed to um, at a fairly young age kind of informed how I speak, so to speak, with a sort of a distinctly Spielbergian accent, I guess you could say.
There's one more thing I wanted to say about Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark. Is that it's called Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark, but it has a recurring theme in all the episodes. It's cars and vehicles.
That's true.
And one thing I love is that there is, going back to attention to detail and things. There's great mechanical design in this show. Another thing that is very lacking in Western animation a lot of the time, and you see a lot of in anime. The cars, they look like actual cars. The guns, they look like actual guns. And
Yeah.
it's important. That's a very important kind of detail for something like this, I think, or for anything, frankly.
Definitely. I think also it's like the kind of stories that I'm telling with Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark are they have to have a level of groundedness to the physicality of the world
Hmm.
that these characters are being portrayed in, because there has to be physical stakes there. That if the world of Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark functioned in a more broad, cartoonish way, where the coyote can walk out off of a cliff and not realize, or not fall until he realizes that there's no ground underneath him, and then be fine after he falls a kilometer down a chasm. Then it's really difficult for the audience to be able to parse out, like, what is the when is it dangerous and when is it not. And when that's kind of the main focus of your story, it's important to sort of establish um, a cohesion to that world. You know what I mean? So that,
Hmm.
and I think that's just an extension of some of the mechanical design, is it's part of that world. You have to kind of believe it a little bit, and it has to function in a way that you recognize, at least. And it doesn't have to be fully realistic, but it's a specific set of rules within its own world that the audience can come to understand,
Yeah.
and that gives form to their expectations of consequences.
All the episodes are set in places that you might recognize or relate to in
Hmm.
reality. Like the third one, especially, it like the way it you do such an effective job in that episode of just setting up the cornfield
Yeah.
as this realm of terror that by the time you see someone step into it, you're just like, oh no, this is gonna go somewhere really badly. You just build up that tension and atmosphere so well throughout
Thanks,
those
man.
throughout those
Thank you.
episodes. And something I loved in the second episode too, the worm, which we didn't talk about as much, like the passage of time, how like the girl's hair, like you see in the photograph,
Yeah.
when she's young, she has her hair is fully red, and you can keep track of what point, like it doesn't go completely,
Yeah, she
um
always has a little
yeah,
of that left in her
a
hair.
little bit left,
Um,
yeah.
but you can sort of, it gives you a frame of reference, at least, for like the time period that's
Hmm.
taking place over, because you didn't want it to feel like, oh, it's just a couple of days. This has to sort of, by necessity of the story, it has to take place over a long period of time. So I mean, I love like telling stories like that. It's super fun in Canada, at least,
Yeah.
in terms of like the animation sophistication of the storytelling.
Going back in time a bit, can you talk a little about how you first got into the animation industry and just kind of starting out back in your days in New Brunswick?
Yeah, well, I'm from New Brunswick, which is a province in Canada, which everyone seems to forget all the time. It actually exists. Um, and I grew up on the North Shore. I've always loved like animation as an art form. Professionally, I started out, I guess the early 2000s, when things were sort of rapidly changing in the animation industry. It was the dawn of like digital animation pipelines really starting to take off. Um, so I worked at a couple shops out on the East Coast, and then Gene Fowler, who you had on a previous episode, had been getting some work at Fat Cat Animation at the time in Miramichi, New Brunswick. Um, and I had always wanted to work in New Brunswick, obviously, where I'm from. So he hired me on as an animator back in, I guess it might have been 2004, 2003. I can't remember. It's like, it's almost 25 years now. So around that time. So um I spent a bunch of years out there. We didn't realize it at the time, but really breaking some interesting ground in terms of how you produce animation domestically. The digital revolution of how production pipelines were being run um, was very powerful, and I think it informed like a ton of the way the industry kind of evolved from there on. Because it wasn't even like really that whole era. Also, there was that CG 3D stuff that was happening, and then there was the 2D sort of flash stuff
Hmm.
that was happening. And as an artist, obviously everybody was like, yeah, the CG 3D stuff is super cool. The Pixar had kind of, cemented their place at that point in the early 2000s as like this really amazing force that were putting out such cool material. And Mainframe had really broken a lot of ground in terms of TV production using those techniques. And so as an artist, that was like the cool thing to do. And 2D digital stuff was not very appealing for a lot of us. It was something that you kind of looked at from a place of ignorance, I would say, just thinking that's crude and not visually sophisticated and not something anybody wants. But then, you know, that's kind of where the work was in a lot of ways. So then we ended up playing with it and realizing, oh no, wait, there's like a ton of potential here for a new way to make uh, animation in a really interesting and efficient pipeline. So we began trying to just push the boundaries of what we could do, at least, and make the best kind of stuff possible. And that sort of, I think, was happening all over the place at the time in the Canadian animation industry.
And when you were at Fat Cat Studio, you worked on a few things. Well, you did 3 Delivery, which
Yeah,
wound up being a little too ambitious, I guess.
definitely, definitely. I mean, yeah, and also there was a lot of different factors going on at the time in
Yeah.
the animation industry. Obviously, the there was that period of the 2008 2009 American mortgage recession or crisis or whatever that really kind of like had a huge impact on the animation industry, and particularly on the East Coast. It was things were getting pretty dire at that point. But yeah, I think 3 Delivery was a interesting endeavor to try and push the boundaries of what you could do with digital animation, and just unfortunately kind of fell victim to the timing.
Another thing, which I am, of course, have to bring up is Space Knights, which was the pilot for the Teletoon Detour
Right.
program. And
Yeah.
I will be honest, Space Knights is not something I've ever really been a fan of, but I am fascinated by it because it really seemed that you guys were just having a lot of fun with this thing. If
Yeah.
people are not familiar with Space Knights, it was this kind of odd Power Rangers parody thing. But
Mhm.
this is the pilot program that ultimately resulted in Forget About It. I'll admit, Angora Napkin was the show that got my vote
Oh,
in
mine
that whole
too.
thing. Yeah.
It got mine too. Definitely.
But you guys did Space Knights, and
Yes.
it was kind of this little playground for you, and you had these like live action segments and stuff. It is a kind of weird, fascinating thing to look back on. I
Definitely. I
feel,
mean,
yeah.
and we were just messing around. I think that was such an interesting time for Canadian animation, original animation, that had so much potential that I think now things have gone sort of like a certain direction. But at the time, there was so much going on, and it really could have been uh just a really cool thing if there had been a great big success. If I think there was an audience that was hungry, there was the means of distributing the material to the audience, there was this moment in time that felt like there was so much possibility.
Can you just tell us where, kind of where you went from there? I think there's a bit of a gap from between where from then when you wound up working at Mercury Filmworks where you did Hilda, but yeah, can you give
Yeah.
just kind of a roadmap of what brought you from that point to working on on a big project like Hilda?
Yeah, that was, I mean, well, what had happened too was, like I had mentioned, that whole period in the industry where there was this big downturn that particularly affected the East Coast, and a lot of shops kind of closed up, and then there were some issues with how the funding systems were working in particularly Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And so my wife actually works in the animation industry as well. And we had a little girl, and we were looking around, and we were saying, we gotta like maybe go somewhere where there's maybe more options for work stability. Like either it was either going to be we were going to have to go to Ontario, or we were going to have to go to the West Coast, British Columbia, some places where there would be a bit more of a healthy ecosystem. And we didn't want to go to the States necessarily, just because we had our little girl, and we wanted to remain in Canada as much as possible. So we decided to just come up to Ontario, because not only in Ontario do you have sort of the options of sort of the animation studios that exist in Ottawa, but the Toronto has a really big animation scene that's maybe the biggest in the country. And so there's a lot of options for provincial tax credits, and so a lot of ways projects at the time particularly were being funded was through uh, federal and provincial tax credits, and you needed to be a resident of that particular province in order to qualify um, as a viable option to be staffed on a show where you could you know receive those tax credits as the company's financing plan. So if you weren't in that province at the beginning of a tax year, then you were not a resident of that province for that year, and thus not really an eligible candidate for the particular positions. If people were looking for someone who was an Ontario resident, you needed to be there. So we thought, let's just go up to Ontario and get some stuff done. And then I had started working with Mercury Filmworks because I I just loved like the work that they were doing at the time. Like in again, when we're talking about that early era of pioneering digital animation, there was very few shops that were really pushing it and saying like, no, we can do really beautiful animation work that has a healthy respect for the craft of animation. We're not just pushing cutouts around. We're using technology in novel ways to try and achieve really beautiful movement and aesthetic qualities that you would never normally be able to afford. So something that stood out a lot to me was the work that was being done at Mercury Filmworks just looked cool. It looked great. I loved like a lot of these shows that they were putting out that were ambitious. And for me, that's the kind of people who I wanted to surround myself with, was artists who really cared about the work and dedicated themselves to really pushing their boundaries and creating something appealing.
At this point in time, we're talking about the about early 2010s
Yeah,
ish period. So
yeah,
they were doing a lot of work for Disney at that time, and Nickelodeon, but also Canadian productions as well. Um,
yeah. That's when I came in
yeah,
essentially, and I had done a little bit of work on those sort of like service shows, but my heart was always in um, original productions, and I
yeah.
my skill set kind of lends itself to um, a lot more of the pre-production stuff in cartoons. Not that I don't love animation and animating, but I am really captivated by storytelling and making creative choices and architecting all of these things. So um, I had done a couple of projects, just animation directing on service shows, and then I directed our show called Atomic Puppet, which was on Teletoon
Hmm.
in, I guess that would have been 2014, maybe. If I may be completely wrong on that date, but I assume it's around that era. And that was a fun show, obviously. It was definitely the kind of show that Teletoon was making at that time. 52 episodes. And, when you're in a production making that many episodes, you're like, some of them you barely remember. You see, oh my God, yeah, I remember that now. You see it on TV and you go, oh, I
Yeah.
totally forgot, like even making that episode.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, Mercury Filmworks did a lot of the Teletoon stuff from that area. Going back a little further, did you work on producing Parker at all?
no, I did not, but I had a lot of friends who did though. That definitely is a deep cut call out.
Obviously, we're going back a little bit, but they're definitely Mercury Filmworks made some like really great looking things. But there's like a kind of a disparity between the shows that are made, like the Canadian shows versus the service shows. Hilda is something that we would define as a service show. Would you say that?
It was more of a co-production
More of
in
a
that
co-production. Okay.
a lot of the heavy lifting was done in Canada. So, right. So
Mm-hmm.
it was produced entirely in Canada.
Yeah, all the animation basically
The
from the ground up.
from the scripting process
Mm-hmm.
was an international
Yeah.
um endeavor, and then everything beyond that was a Canadian product, except voice casting as well was UK. And so from concept design to storyboard, animatic, all production artwork and animation, post-production, music, sound design, everything. This is a complete like Canadian production.
Mm-hmm.
And it was for an American broadcaster. That's sort of like a pretty important distinction, I guess, to make,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the eyes of the larger Canadian media landscape, in that we were not eligible ever to be considered for any kind of like, Canadian uh, awards or recognition, um, specifically because we were exclusively commissioned as a American
Yeah.
Netflix original.
It's sort of what happened with the movie Undertone recently. I don't know if you, going back to horror, basically completely Canadian film by every sensible measure, but it was essentially rejected by the production system here in Canada and was brought out by A24 instead. And again, despite being by every conventional measure a Canadian film, because it's released by A24, it's like sort of put off in this extra category where it does not qualify for the distinction of being Canadian in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. And that seems to also be, yeah, that seems to be the case with a number of things that are animated in Canada as well, including Hilda, obviously.
Yeah, and there's a I think a big percentage of the Canadian animation landscape is sort of pure service, in the sense of there is pre-production being done in either Los Angeles or elsewhere in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's an animation studio, a vendor studio that is hired to execute the animation portion, sometimes the background art along with that, and then sort of deliver that back to the foreign producer. And I think that's sort of what I would consider like a service show.
Okay, all right.
But I think that in terms of like the financing and all of this stuff, it's like it's probably a lot more nebulous than that's not quite that clear cut.
Yeah. And and going back to sort of the vision of where things were going, or the attitude of where things were going back when you started in the industry in the 2000s. I mean, do you feel that in Canada it seems that we can't, like, we can make something like Hilda, but to but Hilda is of course a foreign IP. It's a UK IP. It's an American made with for an American broadcaster essentially.
Yeah.
So it's not by some definitions Canadian, and there's like all these asterisks to it. And do you feel that going back to where you started in the 2000s when you were at working in New Brunswick, I mean, do you feel that the Canadian industry has kind of lost the plot or lost its way, or is there anything that went wrong that you think you could identify? Or I mean, what, it's a big question,
Yeah,
but
that's a huge question.
I'm trying to think of a way to break it down a little bit. You mentioned the optimism that you had back then. I mean, do you think that was accurate? Do you think that your perspective has changed, or do you think things have actually changed in a way that it's maybe
Yeah.
harder to do that kind of thing now?
I think things have definitely changed,
Hmm.
obviously. I think that they're always going to be changing. I think that that's sort of the nature of the this industry that is so closely tied to technology. Um, but it's really difficult, especially right now, to like parse out um, exactly what is currently going on because there's so much novel stuff happening. I do feel like there's a really interesting parallel you could draw between France and Canada
Hmm.
in sort of the evolution of what happened in each of those countries that sort of illustrates some of the great potential that was there in the early 2000s, where I think if you look at France in the early 2000s and Canada in the early 2000s, they're very much on the same playing field in terms of like what's happening in the industry.
There were
And
so many
then
co-productions between
yeah,
Canada and France at that time as well. I mean,
yeah.
you're right, very much on the same page in a lot of
And a
ways.
lot of the same philosophies, I think, in terms of supporting the industries in each of those countries for maybe different reasons. But I think um, you can sort of see what happened in France and you can sort of see what happened in Canada. And I think that there is probably room for an argument to be made that France is definitely in a much stronger position today, not just in terms of like the business and the industry commercially, but also maybe creatively, I think as well. There's really interesting things that have been developed and fostered through a very similar sort of system that we had put into place, but for some reason here, it maybe became a little bit more of a machine that was just making content. It
Hmm.
wasn't necessarily able to grow and mature as much as what I think maybe happened in France. And I don't know the exact answers to why that necessarily is what it is, but I have ideas,
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing to look at. And then now the new interesting wrinkle that has sort of developed is the method of distribution of entertainment has completely changed. And now people have access to huge audiences. Whereas, before you wanted anyone to see the thing that you made, even if you had the iron will to sit down and actually produce something and put in all of those hours and hours of work to make something. How would anybody ever see it? You had to
Hmm.
have some method of distributing that content to an audience who was looking for it. And so you had to use film festivals or have a broadcaster or a film distributor who could put a movie into theaters in some form. But now there is the internet, which opens up that pathway. There is no longer a need necessarily, at least technically, for that middleman. The real wrinkle now is how does that work commercially? How in terms of the business side of that, how do you make it into something that could self-sustain so that it would be economically at least possible for people to independently create things with some hope that you wouldn't basically be losing your shirt on it. Um, and that's a really interesting new thing that has
Hmm.
started to develop that I think kind of for us here in Canada is very hopeful. And I'm super curious to see how this stuff kind of evolves.
In some ways, both the Canadian production industry and animation industry specifically, there's certain kinds of ruts that they can be kind of be caught in to different extents. But obviously, there's many complaints and criticisms of the way streaming works, many of which we have made on this. I have made on this podcast over the years, for sure. But it definitely opens potentials. You look at heated rivalry. This is something that
Mhm.
even if something like this had been made, um, 10 to 15 years ago, it would have like it would have been it would have had a harder time finding an audience. It would have been running at like midnight on the movie network or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And like, yeah, it would maybe win a bunch of awards, but no one would watch it there. Whereas you have it on a streaming platform now on multiple countries, and it's become this massive thing. So as someone who has, you know, worked on different types of animation productions, as someone who has is that you are developing your own IP with Don't Walk. I keep messing this up. Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark. It is a little bit of a mouthful.
It is.
You know, you've tried pitching it, and you're trying to find different ways of executing it, and ignoring the fact that like Crave and our own CBC Gem and our own streaming platforms seem to have some issues with animation. I find that Crave is maybe Bell Media has particularly been kind of resistant to it historically. I've found, just as an observation. Do you think that there could be a way to take like a Canadian IP and get it on, have it made in a Canadian studio with good production values, similar to something like Hilda? And I mean, I think Hilda is one of the most gorgeous Canadian shows ever, animated shows ever made, and get it on, you know, a Canadian platform here or on different platforms in different countries, and have it find an audience that way. Do you think that can be done, or do you think there's maybe more potential in just trying to rough it out on your own and get it on YouTube or something like that, which is kind of something I talked a little bit with Gene about on his episode as well. Like, do you think there's a pathway to do it through like a pipeline to take a Canadian IP, have it made in Canada and streamed in Canada, and find an audience?
If I'm gonna be honest, I do, at least I tend to believe we probably have to go other ways. That's not to say that that definitely is the correct answer. I think obviously it's possible for it to happen, but all of the pieces have to fall into the right places. And right now it's very difficult because there really are no places, like, just particularly the animation space has been very dominated by sort of targeting the kids media as a demographic. There's still preschool material that can be made, but by and large in Canada, for Canadians, there's not a lot of places that would even buy a kids show, and most animation in Canada just happens to also be kid shows. So, you know, I think that's a big hurdle. I think that there's opportunity in you know, broadening the scope of what animation is and who it's for a much different audience. There's a lot of potential for adult audiences of all different kinds to access this kind of stuff. But again, there is no like established place to showcase any of this stuff that an audience would go to find that kind of material in Canada, at least. That, so it makes it really hard to even get some kicks at the can to try and find that magic combination of timing and people and creative material and audience that clicks, and you get something that really works. You need to have some runway to be able to do that, and there's not a ton of that right now, at least the way things currently are, with how streaming has effectively really reduced the traditional media landscape in Canada. And I think it's easy in Canada for us to allow that to happen because we've kind of adopted this American culture by proxy, right? The differences between Canada and America are, you know, they are real, but they're, at least, you know, the similarities are very strong, and so we're able to sort of just kind of not have to really put in the work because we can kind of just adopt American media as our own, and still have all kinds of entertainment.
These days, personally, that's something I'm becoming more critical of. It's just like, do we have to depend on the United States?
I think we should be critical of it. I think that it's honestly, because if you look back in time, obviously you can see there is a way to make it work where Canadian artists can make Canadian art for a Canadian audience. And, you know, there was a time when I was a kid that there were, you know, Canadian bands who made Canadian music in Canada, and they toured Canada, and their entire careers were sort of, you know, hyper focused on being a homegrown act, and they made great livings, and they were, very successful. Now it's quite difficult to do that. You really have to be targeting an international
Mhm.
audience, because we just sort of have let our media landscape um, atrophy, for lack of a better word, because of the reliance on, like, well, we can still listen to American tunes, and
Yeah.
we can just watch American shows and check out American movies. And, like, I think that has had a detrimental effect on our shared culture here in Canada, that should be something that we all value and cherish and foster, because I think that, especially in media, um, that is like a necessary ingredient for a healthy society, for different people to be able to all live together, is to have some touchstone together, to share some kind of culture. Um, and we've kind of fragmented into like very hyper niche pockets
Yeah.
of people. It's not good.
The internet has played a big role in that, and that's everywhere
Yeah.
too. But I mean, personally, especially with how things have been playing out over the last year or so, I've been, I've been trying to just not see American movies in theaters. I'm just like,
Yeah.
and I'm someone who goes to the theaters. I'm like, I'm gonna go see a movie from some other country, and and I feel that there can be a better way. And also, look in terms of getting things made. I think I think one thing maybe kind of holding my perspective back as a viewer and a pundit and someone who follows anime is that I wish we had something like the manga to anime adaptation pipeline they
Mhm.
have in Japan, where you have this monstrous amount of original IP coming out in comics, and then the pathway to get it made into a an animated series is very well established and frequent. But most places in the world don't have something like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of not achievable. But it is interesting that you compare us to France, and they are making stuff, but they're still not making a lot. Like, I even feel that France could be making more. They put out a TV show, like an animated series now and again. You're getting movies like Mars Express
Mhm.
from them, but their output is still kind of limited. But
They're a small country,
they're
obviously,
small.
what I
Yeah.
mean. And I think maybe the delineating factor between France and Canada is maybe the language barrier of that. Like, it's very
Yeah.
easy for us to adopt American stuff because we speak essentially English in this
Yeah.
country, even though we are a bilingual country.
Well, I mean, French Canada has its own production ecosystem
Yeah,
too,
and
but
I
again, it's very
think,
small and
yeah,
limited,
but
and
I
not
think you could
producing animation.
argue
So,
at scale it's probably healthier than the
oh
English
yes.
sector of even though Quebec's population is not gigantic in the broad scope of like the world. It, for the size of what it is, it probably has a fairly healthy media ecosystem, that if it had scaled out to the rest of the country in the same way, I think we would be in a better state than we are currently. But I do feel like the advent of the way the internet can um, allow access to audiences now is a great thing, particularly for Canadian artists who are living in Canada. I do feel that um it's their audience by necessity is going to be international, but there's ways to find a way to make a living in the arts, or in media on the internet, that is very interesting. And we have such talented people who live in this country and work in this country that definitely could make amazing things, could make amazing movies, could make amazing comic books, could make amazing animated series, could make, the all kinds of great music. There's so many talented people who have real experience, in the industries of our media, that if they were given a shot, they could really make some great stuff. But it's just really hard
Hmm.
to find those opportunities for everybody. And maybe this new frontier of um, independently releasing material and finding a way to make that commercially viable is something that that could be really exciting and change things. I will say that I could have made Hilda as a Canadian TV show if anyone in Canada would have had the guts to greenlight a show like that. And I had pitched a show that I did not get any traction on before I made Hilda, which was essentially all of the ideas that I then injected into Hilda. It was called Out of the Woods,
Oh,
and it was a show that I felt like was going to be really great. But it at the time was too different from what everyone was already making. And the only reason Hilda was ever able to be made was because Netflix was so new at the time that they were willing to take risks on things that were a little outside the box.
would they take a risk on something like Hilda now, do you think?
No, probably not. Well, I
Oh,
mean,
wow.
maybe, but I doubt it.
Yeah.
I highly doubt it.
Andy, could you please tell us more about Out of the Woods?
Well, Out of the Woods was a show that I developed that I was pitching probably around 2012, 2013. Um, that or maybe it was even maybe into 2014, maybe like that kind of era, that had a lot of the ideas that I eventually ended up using in Hilda, which centered on a couple of brothers and their older sister who encountered all kinds of strange folklore creatures. I was like very obsessed as a kid with this book by Brian Froud called Fairies. Um, Brian is he's an artist who worked for like the Jim Henson Company, and he had released this really amazing illustrated book cataloging all kinds of um Celtic folklore creatures. And as a kid, I was so into that book that it became kind of the inspiration for what I was building Out of the Woods around. But at the time, it was just such a departure from what most people would have produced for an audience of, 8 to 12 kids. And had it been greenlit, it would have been a really wonderful show that people would have loved. But it was perhaps just not great timing. And also, I'm sure from the perspective of a broadcaster is like everybody tells you that their idea is
Yeah.
great. And how do you parse who's telling you the truth and who's not? There's no way to know. So I think ultimately that's the way it goes sometimes. But luckily, when we were developing Hilda, I was able to just get those kinds of stories told and at least prove that there is really an audience who would love that kind of stuff, and that it works on a creative level at least.
Wow, fascinating.
Maybe someday I'll make that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe someday
Well,
I'll pull that pitch out and someone will want to make it. Who
I mean,
knows?
getting these ideas out there is hard, but I mean, so many people working in the animation industry, just all have these great ideas for shows that could be made.
Yeah.
But we need the will to give something like this a shot a lot of the
Yeah.
time. It's great that Hilda got made, but I would have loved to see the original concept, or the concept you were
Yeah. I mean,
your original IP, if you will.
it would have been awesome. It definitely would have been a very exciting idea. And it just, it's the timing of all these things. But, nowadays I think that there's a real like opportunity for Canadian creatives to find an audience online and find a way to make it that there could be a viable commercial path to making something, even if it's small scale. I don't know. There's ways of sort of monetizing content that are clever. Like obviously merchandising is a big thing for people, which I don't really know much about, but that definitely probably is one avenue. People do sort of have intimate relationships with their audience in terms of Patreons or memberships on YouTube or whatever, those avenues are where people sort of, support the endeavor because they're getting the material, the entertainment that they would like to get. So there's a possibility you could build in Canada a way to make stuff like that.
What about other like existing properties that are already like books or comics that have been made in Canada? Like, can that give things any kind of leverage when in terms of getting things made, or does that kind of notoriety not go very far? Because I know there's a film coming out that Seth Rogen's production company helped get off the ground called Tangles.
Hmm.
You probably heard about it. It's
Yep.
probably going to be a big release later this year based off of a
Hmm.
Canadian graphic novel. They changed the setting of the movie. I won't get into that. But that makes me wonder, and I don't know if you have any better idea than I do, but I wonder if there could be more opportunities for for existing works like that uh
Hmm.
to sort of get
Definitely,
made. Yeah.
yes. I would say just in the sense that maybe if it came with a built-in audience, that's
Yeah.
like sort of the value that an IP would bring to something. But obviously that does come at a cost as well. And so that makes it just another challenge to then reaching that threshold of commercial viability. So you
Hmm.
have to satisfy whatever the needs would be to acquire um, an IP of some kind, unless you're the person who made the IP, and then you could also, try and produce an adaptation in a different medium. But I think there's something really powerful in that if a property has a fan base that really love it and would support an endeavor of like the Lackadaisy animated
Hmm.
series obviously comes from the an adaptation of that Lackadaisy comic that built a audience for stuff like that
And it's
that then can be
Glitch
leveraged.
Studios doing that, I believe, right?
Yeah,
Or
at this point, they
yeah.
they eventually sort of partnered with Glitch and stuff, but there was a period where they were just building that from their audience's support of that property and able to marshal enough resources to make really amazing, beautiful work that I think proves at least the theory that this is a way that it can be done if there were the right people with the right ideas at the right time, um, able to really get stuff out there and take a crack at it. So
Yeah.
it's
And
uh, it's very interesting.
I guess one other thing that can create problems when existing properties here get too big is that it can be option for Hollywood sometimes, and that just kind of
Yeah.
takes it off the table entirely.
Yeah, and that's all of that stuff. Like
Yeah.
once like something becomes lucrative enough that it's sort of enmeshed in the traditional media landscape, it's kind of out of the league of the small time creator to
Yeah.
be able to make it work anyway. Because it's like it's just an extra problem then to have to surmount is how do you afford, you know, to navigate that kind of stuff when you don't have a ton of resources to work with. I think it's on that level probably just more viable to have creatives making original properties that kind of resonate with audiences, find stuff that works.
All right. Andy, thanks so much for coming on. This is fantastic. I'm so happy I had the chance to talk to you today. And I just wanted to know if you can let people know where, if anywhere, they can find you online, and also what you're working on. I'm assuming there is still more to come of Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark, right? Or there's going to be an episode 4?
There is more Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark coming very soon. I will be releasing a new video um, that I'm very, very close to having it ready to go. So you can look forward to that on YouTube at Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark. I mean, you could just search it up. It's there. It's I use the acronym for the YouTube channel, so it's at DWHAAD. Um, and but if you just Google Don't Walk Home Alone After Dark, it'll come up. And you can look forward to a brand new episode soon, and hopefully many more installments to come. We'll see how it goes.
I'm excited. And yeah, thanks for tuning into Zonan Canada. You can reach me on Blue Sky at jbetteridge or email zonancannada@gmail.com. The theme song is by Ultraclystron. That can be found on his album Packet Flood, and you can find that at ultraclystron.com. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, Spotify, or your podcast app of choice. And I'll see you again.